I'm a skeptic at heart, but some of my in-laws have what they describe as a gift for seeing ghosts. It's not something they flaunt or dramatize. It's more like a hereditary quirk that occasionally reveals itself. They don't try to nurture it or explore it, and I actually dislike talking about it. My natural inclination is to look for logical explanations, especially when it's just one person claiming to experience something. But when two people see the same thing, that's harder to dismiss. My sister-in-law has this gift, as do a few of her kids. They avoid discussing it, unless absolutely necessary, and when they do, it's with reluctance. For the kids, being asked if they've seen something is met with the kind of weird embarrassment you might expect if they were being asked about if they wet the bed. Their reactions always seem genuine, like this is an unwanted burden rather than a talent. One day, my sister-in-law and her family visited the cemetery to pay respects to their great-grandfather. On their way out, they noticed another funeral taking place for someone else. That's when things got strange. As they were driving away, my sister-in-law and her 14-year-old son noticed a young girl standing around 40 feet from their car. She was roughly 20 feet from the group gathered from the funeral. The girl was wearing a white dress and had long hair, and stood completely alone from the mourners. At first, my sister-in-law and nephew started asking each other, who was the lone girl, and why was she so far away from everyone else? Do you see her? The girl in white dressed by that tree. Both of them confirmed they saw her clearly, but when they pointed her out to three others in the car, no one else could see her at all. Confused, they stopped the car trying to figure out what was going on. My sister-in-law and her son became more insistent, practically going nuts, trying to explain and pointing. She's right there, look! Left of the tree! White dress, black hair, just standing there. The girl didn't look like a stereotypical ghost. No see-through appearance or glowing aura. She looked solid, like a regular person. But something about her felt off. It was a freezing day, and everyone else was bundled up in thick coats. Yet this girl was standing there in nothing but her dress, completely unaffected by the cold. The more they described her, the eerier it became. The girl appeared to be around 11 or 12, and seemed oblivious to the world around her. Despite the strange situation, my sister-in-law and nephew were adamant that what they saw wasn't a figment of their imaginations. They described the exact same thing independently of each other, without an opportunity to coordinate or fabricate the story. I wouldn't normally give much weight to something like this, but their descriptions matched perfectly, and their reactions were far too intense to just ignore. It wasn't a story told for attention. They were genuinely shaken and baffled that no one else could see the girl. Even as a skeptic, I can't quite explain this one away, and that frightens me. I live in Atsuki, Kanagawa, and have only been on my own here since I graduated college. Atsuki is a pretty quiet place, especially where I live, way out near the mountains. I didn't grow up around the mountains, as I'm originally from Chiba, so I like having them nearby. Every day after work, I like to take the long way home, walking while admiring how the sunset paints the mountains in deep, glowing reds. But one day, something about the view was off. At first, I couldn't figure it out. Then it hit me. Something was sticking out of the mountain. It was a thin, black shape, standing tall at the very peak like some strange tower. But it wasn't there the day before. Maybe it's the new radio tower, I thought. Except it didn't look right. It was way too thin, like tree thin, and easily 4 or 5 times taller than any tower I'd ever seen. It didn't even look like it should be able to stand upright, especially without any visible supports. The more I stared at it, the more wrong it seemed. I stood there for a while squinting, trying to make sense of it, and that's when it moved. It started swaying. At first, it was just a slight motion, like a tree caught in a light breeze. But soon the movements became wilder, more erratic, like something shaking a long, thin pole as hard as they could. Then it started writhing. I'm not entirely sure how to describe it, But to me it was like watching an insect larva wriggling in water, a mosquito larva perhaps. It twisted and bent in ways that no rigid structure should be able to. And then came the sound. It started faintly, almost like a distant hum, but it grew louder and louder until I couldn't ignore it. It was a terrible, mournful wail, something between the twang of a biwa and the shrill cry of a baby. It wasn't a sound you'd hear naturally. It felt like it was coming from deep inside my skull, vibrating in my bones. At the same time, it almost felt like a voice. I don't know how to explain it. It was so weird. My body froze, but my mind screamed to run. I know instinctively that whatever I was looking at wasn't supposed to be seen. I don't know how I knew, but I did. If I kept staring, something terrible would happen. So I tore my eyes away, clamped my hands over my ears, and began walking fast. I kept my gaze locked on the forest trail, focusing on every step, refusing to look up no matter how strong the urge was. The sound didn't stop though. It felt like it was following me, growing louder the further I walked. My chest tightened with panic. Even when I reached my front door, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was out there, somehow aware of my presence and location. Once inside, I sat in my dark apartment, sweating, hands pressed over my ears for what felt like hours. I was scared. I didn't want to hear that horrible noise in my home. I just felt instinctively like I had to hide from it. After that night, I made a point to take a different route home. Even though I really enjoyed my stroll along the forest trail most nights, it wasn't worth the risk. It added an extra 10 minutes to my commute, but I didn't care. For weeks, everything was fine. Then earlier today, I made the mistake of returning. I don't know what I was thinking, perhaps trying to prove to myself that it had all been in my head. But when I got to the spot where I'd seen it, the mountains looked normal. No black shape, no terrible sounds. But still something felt off. For the past few weeks, there's been an unusual number of public announcements about missing elderly people. It's always been a thing in this area, old folks wandering off and getting lost. But lately it's been happening a lot. I can't help but wonder, what if they saw it too? What if they followed the sounds? And what if they never came back? That's my story. I don't know if it's connected to the disappearances, but be careful if you're ever walking near the mountains. Because sometimes, things grow there that really shouldn't. A few years ago, I had a strange and unsettling encounter while hiking in the mountains. The memory of it still sends a chill down my spine whenever I think about it. The day started off innocently enough. The mountain trail was one I'd taken many times before, a well-trodden path surrounded by dense forest. The trees on the trail loomed high overhead, blocking out the sunlight. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil and moss. Occasionally the wind would whistle through the trees, making them creak and sway, but otherwise it was eerily silent, too silent, as if the mountain was holding its breath. It was a perfect autumn day. I was halfway down the trail when I saw her. She was standing right in the middle of the path, her figure barely visible through the shadows cast by the trees. At first I thought she was just another hiker, but as I got closer I realized something was off. She looked as if she was trembling. Her arms were wrapped around herself as if trying to hold her body together. When she saw me, her face twisted with desperation, and she burst into tears. "Please, please go down the mountain with me." The raw fear in her voice stopped me in my tracks. There was no way I could leave her like that, so I nodded. "All right, let's go together." Now I was a bit annoyed because I hadn't really finished my hike, but still I couldn't leave her like that. As we started walking, I couldn't help but notice how tightly she clung to my jacket. Her grip was ice cold. Her hands shook so much that I could feel it through the fabric. I tried to ask her what had happened, but she didn't answer. She just kept muttering under her breath, a jumbled mix of words that sounded like a Buddhist chant. Her eyes darted around wildly, as if she were expecting something to leap out at us at any moment. It put me on edge. The further we went, the heavier the atmosphere became. The wind had died completely, leaving a stillness that made every sound, our footsteps, the rustle of leaves, feel unnaturally loud. Even the birds had gone silent, as if they too were hiding from something. Finally, we reached the base of the mountain. The moment her feet hit ground level, the woman collapsed onto her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. I crouched beside her and with a little apprehension asked, "Are you okay?" She didn't respond right away. Instead, she glanced around all panicky, and then she let out her long, trembling sigh and whispered, "It's gone." We made our way to a small souvenir shop that doubled as a rest area. Inside, the dim lighting and the musty smell of old wood felt oddly comforting. The woman sat down heavily on a bench, still trembling, and finally told me her story. She explained that while she was hiking, she'd heard singing. It started faint, just a soft hum carrying on the wind like a child's voice. At first, I thought it was someone playing around, maybe a family with kids up the trail. But as she kept walking, the singing didn't fade. Instead, it grew louder, clearer, and stranger. The melody was slow and haunting like an old nursery rhyme, but the words didn't make sense. She looked around, but the trail was empty. No one was there. That's when she realized the sound wasn't coming from a particular direction. It was just there, surrounding her. She tried to brush it off as her imagination and kept walking. But no matter how far she went, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Then she noticed something even more disturbing. She wasn't getting anywhere. Every time she thought she'd made progress, she'd look around and find herself returning to the same spot where she'd first heard the singing. The loop continued. She'd walk, hear the song, and end up back where she started. Each time the singing grew louder, closer, and then it began to change. The voice, if you could even call it that, sounded gleeful, almost hysterical, as if whoever or whatever was singing was delighting in her fear. She started hearing words. At first, they were too faint to make out, but as the voice drew nearer, they became chillingly clear. For the twilight, darkness falls. You can't escape the underworld, and your soul is desired. She said she could only remember this part, but believes there were probably multiple parts of the rhyme. She froze. The voice was right behind her now, so close she could feel it cold and heavy pressing down on her. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. All she could do was stand there, paralyzed, until I happened to walk by. I listened to her story in stunned silence, and honestly, the hair on the back of my neck was standing on end. I'd never expected what sounded like the plot of a horror movie to come out of this perfect stranger's mouth. She was a middle-aged woman, and what she was explaining to me felt out of the norm. I've hiked that mountain dozens of times, and never experienced anything remotely like what she described. It's just a regular tourist spot. There's no folklore, no urban legends, nothing. Even the elderly shopkeeper shook his head when I asked him about it. He said he'd lived there his whole life, and had never heard of anything strange happening in those woods. But then, the woman said something that made my blood run cold. Quietly, almost as if to herself, she murmured, "I've seen someone like that before. A man. He was standing in the same spot frozen, just like I was. I helped him down the mountain just like you helped me." I stared at her. I remembered my mouth felt dry. Was this some kind of curse? A loop that trapped anyone who stumbled into it? I didn't want to know. I just wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. Since that day, I haven't gone hiking alone on that particular mountain trail, and don't think I ever will. Perhaps the only way to escape the mountain after hearing the rhyme is with the help of someone who hasn't heard it. I currently live at a job corps center that was built on the site of an old military base. Over the years, it's well known that people have passed away here, both during its time as a military installation and after it became a job corps facility. There's no doubt in my mind this place is haunted. Most of the activity is minor, small, strange occurrences you can almost brush off. But of all the experiences, there's one that stands out as the worst by far. It was late at night, sometime between 1 and 3 a.m. I was in bed. I tend to sleep on my stomach, so I didn't actually see what happened, but I'll never forget what I heard and felt. Now, wall ghosts, as we call them, are pretty common here. They knock on the walls or make faint tapping noises, especially late at night. Sure, it's unsettling, but not unusual. However, on this particular night, they were far more active than I'd ever experienced. Their constant knocking actually woke me up. At first, I tried to dismiss it and go back to sleep, but then I heard 3 loud, deliberate knocks right next to my bed. Before I could react, something slammed on the edge of my bed. It felt like someone sitting down really hard, and I could feel the weight pressing into the mattress. I froze, absolutely terrified. The indentation on the bed didn't disappear right away. It stayed there for what felt like forever, as though someone or something was still sitting there. Eventually the weight began to lift, and the bed slowly rose back to normal. As soon as it did, I turned to look, but there was nothing there. My roommates were still in their beds, and I didn't hear any footsteps leaving my area. When I asked them about it the next morning, they were confused. They had no idea what I was talking about. Meanwhile, I was horrified. To this day, that remains the most intense ghost encounter I've ever experienced. But that wasn't the end of it. Someone else had a similar experience that same night. They woke up feeling a hand on them, cold, heavy, and unmistakably real. It scared them just as much as my experience scared me, and the fact that it happened on the same night only made it worse. I've started keeping crystal rocks by my bed. I'm not sure if they truly work, but I sometimes wonder if they're the only thing protecting me from something much worse. Whatever is in this place is not friendly. As I try to rationalize what happened, I can't shake the memory of those knocks, that weight, and the sense that I wasn't alone that night. This story comes from my old supervisor. We both worked at a large music brand company known for making guitars. One day while chatting during a break, he shared a story that still gives me chills. He told me about an old legend among our team. Apparently, a senior member had once warned him about the man. According to this senior colleague, a spirit would visit the shop every night around closing. If you hear loud music and a machine running, don't worry about it, the senior had said with a shrug. That's so-and-so. He's friendly. Curious, my supervisor asked about the ghost's origin. As the story went, years before I was hired, an elderly man had worked in the machine shop. He was a skilled and dedicated employee, but sadly he passed away after suffering a medical emergency at work, likely a stroke or heart attack. Though he was rushed to the hospital, he didn't survive. The shop had since been relocated, and our team took over the odd space. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but my supervisor soon experienced something he couldn't explain. One night, he was locking up the shop later than usual. It had been a long day, and he was the last one there. As he made his way through the building, he suddenly heard the faint hum of a machine. Confused, he thought someone must have left a grinder or another piece of equipment running. As he approached to investigate, the sound grew louder. Then, he began to hear something else. Mexican music, blasting so loudly it filled the entire area. At that moment, he froze. His mind immediately jumped to the ghost story. "Nope," he shouted into the empty room, his voice echoing against the walls. Without taking another step, he turned on his heel, locked the door behind him, and hurried to clock out. From that day forward, he never stayed late at the shop again. If he ever worked late, he made sure to finish and lock up before closing time. The experience left such an impression on him that he told me, "I'll never forget that night. Don't care how friendly they were. I weren't sticking around to find out." The strange thing is, others who stayed late in that shop reported hearing the same music and machine noises, always accompanied by an overwhelming feeling of being watched. Whatever it was, a lingering spirit or an eerie coincidence, it was enough to keep everyone most cautious after dark. I currently live in a basement, but this one is part of an old farmhouse built in the 1980s. While the house has been remodeled in some areas, it still carries an eerie and lingering atmosphere. There's a rumor that the original owner may have passed away in the home itself, though I've never been able to confirm it. For the past few years, my family and I noticed a lot of strange occurrences, things that defy explanation. Unfortunately, none of us have managed to capture any video or photographic evidence. The activity happens too quickly, or at the oddest moments. The strange events range from objects inexplicably moving to full-on physical apparitions in certain parts of the house. The most terrifying encounter I've personally experienced happened one night after school. My sister and I were getting ready for bed in the basement, where our beds were positioned behind an old safe and a shelf. As usual, we decided to turn off all the lights before settling in. My sister got up to turn off the lights, but suddenly froze in panic. She said she could hear the sound of a bag being dragged across the floor, and even saw it move right in front of her. Frightened, she told me to grab a flashlight, and as soon as I turned it on, she bolted back to her bed. Before she could sit down, we both heard something start pounding on the safe, a loud, deliberate noise, as if someone or something were punching it, trying to get through or open the door. Neither of our beds touched the safe, and there was no plausible explanation for the sound. Curious but terrified, I leaned over to look between the safe and the shelf. That's when I saw it, a face staring back at me. We didn't sleep at all that night. From then on, we were extra cautious about being in the basement, especially after dark. About a year later, the activity began to spread to the stairwell. At night, we'd hear footsteps or loud banging noises. Sometimes the sound would start in the garage, connect to the stairs, and travel down to the furthest part of the basement, always the area furthest from my room. The basement has several support beams, and while they sometimes creak naturally, we've heard them being hit when no one was around. The force of the strikes was so strong that the vibrations could be felt and heard upstairs. This year, the activity has been worse than ever. I haven't been home much, often returning around 11 p.m. or later. My mum has started noticing things herself. She's heard tapping on the poles, objects being thrown against the walls or floors, and movement in the stairwell when no one is nearby. When I'm home alone, the activity intensifies. I've had items moved right outside my door, hearing disembodied voices, and felt an oppressive sense of unease. The most unsettling voice is the one that mimics my youngest brother's. His room is upstairs, far from mine, but I can distinctly hear his voice in the basement. Even my friends have picked up on this. While gaming late at night, they've heard a voice from my headset and asked who else was in the room. It's terrifying because there's never anyone there. My aunt sometimes stays with us for a few nights, and she's experienced it too. The banging noises keep her awake, and she has nightmares whenever she stays in the basement. These nightmares persist for days after she's gone back home. This isn't everything we've experienced, but I don't want to make this too long or dull for anyone listening. This isn't some scary for fun, it's my real life, and I'm genuinely terrified. I don't know what to do to make it stop. And everyone thinks I'm crazy. We checked the old gun safe in the basement, which still has a lock on it. I don't think we have the key. It was left behind by the previous owners. I'm hesitant to try forcing it open, worried it might make things worse. The activity has been quiet lately, but a few days ago my mum swore she heard me coming upstairs. The only problem was, I wasn't home. I had already left an hour before it happened. This happened when I was around 15 or so. I am a female and had made a new friend called Kara, and I was at their sister Anna's flat. Anna's flatmate Tina was home, so there were 4 of us sitting around having coffee and a chat. I needed to use the loo and was directed there. The bathroom was huge, with a clawfoot bath in one corner. The loo was diagonally opposite the bath. While I was on there, I saw from the corner of my eye a young woman of a similar age sitting in the bathtub. I almost jumped up mid-pee. When I looked back at the bathtub, she wasn't there. I've had many experiences with spirits, so I didn't find this strange. It was just the initial moment when she appeared that I got a bit of a fright. I got up, went to wash my hands, and saw her from the corner of my eye again. So I kept not looking at her, and was able to see a bit more of what she looked like. She was smiling the whole time, and was pointing outwards towards the lounge. I knew that she wanted me to tell the others she was there. This is sometimes part of my experience. It's like the spirits in my mind, and I can sense what they're trying to communicate. Back in the 90s, I was a bellman at the U.S. Grant Hotel in downtown San Diego. I worked there for several years and would regularly do room checks with my master key to check on the condition of the room, to see if it was cleaned or occupied or whatnot, and report this to the front desk so they could book the room. One night while working alone, I was sent to check a list of rooms, including room 315. The U.S. Grant in the late 90s was a sight to see, with old-fashioned architecture and portraits hung on the walls. It felt and looked haunted, which was really cool. I walked up, and right as I put the key in the door, I felt a chill creep up my spine, and the hair stood on my arms. I had a feeling of dread. As I opened the door, I noticed around the corner that a window facing 3rd Avenue was open, and there was a breeze coming from outside. As I walked into the room out of the corner of my eye, I could see a long red piece of fabric in the bathroom. I shuddered, and a cold feeling came over me that I'll never forget. I ran out of the room and down the hall as fast as I could, down the stairs and into the bell closet. I was so very shaken, and did not tell anyone because I knew no one would believe a word of it. Several weeks later, I was standing at the entrance of the hotel, where we greeted the guests, and the general manager walked by me with a hotel guest. I overheard the guest ask the manager, "So is the hotel haunted?" To which he replies, "Well, years ago there was a couple to be married in the hotel ballroom. At the last minute, the groom absconded and left the bride at the altar. Overcome with grief, the bride put on a red dress and jumped out of the window on the 3rd floor down to her death. That was room 315. Before my parents were divorced, we lived in the same condo, and the main thing we would experience is the lights turning off by themselves. My dad was an electrician, so he would always check the bulbs and wiring, and nothing was ever wrong with it. My mum would always chalk it up to a dead bulb, but it would almost always seem to work fine afterwards. It wasn't until I was older that my mum and dad told me their experiences in that condo. My mum, being the paranoid and caring mother that she was, would always come and check on me and my brother periodically through the night. Me and my brother would always fall asleep with the TV on, so she would get up, go to the bathroom and check on us before turning the TV off to save energy. Well, according to my mum, she would wake up later in those nights to go to the bathroom and check on us again, only to find the TV off and both me and my brother fast asleep. Me and my brother had no memory of ever waking up and turning the TV on. My dad only ever talked about it once to my older brother. Apparently one night my dad was up late, which he tended to do as he was a night owl, and sometimes I'd catch him at midnight watching Game of Thrones and eating a bowl of Fruity Pebbles. He was in the kitchen. Now, my kitchen and living room were a bit different in the sense that we had a sort of wooden sliding door that acted as a window between the kitchen and living room. Basically, you could see everything but the floor of the living room. My parents slept upstairs and had a flight of stairs that had a platform and that had a railing and a wall where you couldn't see the door of the bedroom. My dad was in the kitchen and looked out that sliding window and was able to make out something humanoid crouched on all fours. He walked out of the kitchen into the living room to see what it was, but it was gone. I've tried to look up the history of the house online, but they were fairly new when we moved in. I lived in Northern California, so it's very plausible that there were Maidu Indians that died there. I'm Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Choctaw, and sometimes I wonder if maybe my heritage has something to do with it. We lived in the Heritage Manor condos. I believe they're on Greenback in Citrus Heights, California. We've also heard a lot of stories about the bluffs of the American River being cursed. I worked in a home for the elderly as a nurse practitioner for 22 years, and during that time, I encountered numerous spiritual experiences that left a profound impact on me. This one in particular. At the time, I was working in our hospital unit, which had 14 beds for patients. One evening, we had a woman who was nearing the end of her journey, actively transitioning. As I made my rounds, I happened to pass by her room and instinctively glanced inside. To my surprise, she was sitting up on the edge of her bed, smiling, a serene, joyful expression lighting up her face. I almost kept walking, but something felt off. She hadn't been well enough to sit up for days. In fact, she had lost one of her legs some time ago, yet I distinctly saw her with both legs at that moment. I froze, and a strange feeling washed over me. It dawned on me that something wasn't quite right. I retraced my steps, backing to peer into her room again, and when I did, I saw her lying peacefully on her bed, just as she had been all day, missing the leg she'd lost. What I had just witnessed felt like a glimpse of something beyond. I wonder if I had caught a brief version of her soul preparing to leave her body, the joy of release already evident in her radiant smile. At the end of my shift, I went home, but the feeling stayed with me. Then as I walked into my house, I saw her again, this time standing in my hallway. She looked different, though. She had both legs, was younger by decades, and her smile brighter, full of peace and joy. I stood there frozen but unafraid. I smiled back at her, silently thanking her for the visit, and slowly she faded away before my eyes, leaving the room feeling warm and full of calm. Still processing what happened, I called my workplace and asked the on-duty nurse to check on her. Moments later, the nurse came back on the phone, confirming what I had already felt deep in my heart. She had passed. I've never forgotten that experience. It was as if she had chosen to touch in, to share her joy with me as she moved on to whatever comes next. In that moment, I felt blessed to be part of such a sacred and beautiful transition. When I was a kid, we lived in a big, old house that had been transformed into a duplex, but we all, the whole family, lived there. One early Sunday morning, I was awake but still lying in bed when I saw a very elegant-looking couple walk right through my wall, across the room, and exit through the other wall. I was stunned. As soon as I could, I told my mum about it and described the couple in detail. That's when she told me something that shook me. 3 other members of my family had also seen the woman I described, but I was the only one who'd ever seen their husband. Later on, I learned the truth. My mum and 2 aunts had used a Ouija board, and the ghost had revealed her name, Olivia. Intrigued, they looked into the town records and confirmed that Olivia had indeed lived in that house. She was even buried in the town cemetery, just a few kilometers away. One night around 3 in the morning, I was sitting in my living room, comfortably scrolling through my phone. The light from the TV and lamps created a peaceful atmosphere, and Willie, my beloved dachshund, was sleeping soundly next to me. The silence was almost hypnotic, until something in my peripheral vision caught my attention. The sheet we had hanging in the doorway of the living room was swaying gently back and forth. At first, I thought it was just a fan or someone entering the room, but there was something about the movement that made me pause. I decided to look up, and that's when I saw her. A floating, bluish, translucent figure that looked like an old-time pirate woman gently pulled the sheet aside and glided into the room, hovering about 2 or 3 feet off the ground. My heart stopped. I couldn't speak or move. My eyes followed her every movement, disbelief washing over me. She disappeared into thin air as if she had never been there. But then Willie, who had been sleeping soundly until that moment, suddenly shot up. He started growling and barking, the hair on the back of his neck standing straight up, staring right at the spot where the woman had vanished to. His reaction confirmed what I had just witnessed. I wasn't dreaming, nor was I sleep-deprived. Willie had seen it too. To this day, no one believes me. They look at me with skepticism when I tell the story, and I understand it sounds like something out of a tale. But when I think back to my dog's reaction, I knew that what I had seen was as real as the air I was breathing. I can't explain who that woman was or why she appeared, but I know that night something far beyond had crossed into our world, and Willie, my faithful companion, witnessed it right there with me. I'm definitely sure the paranormal exists after my experience. There's an old railway track about 300 meters from my house. It's still active, and growing up, a lot of neighbors and I witnessed several people being hit by trains. 90% of the time, they were taking their own life. When I was 18, I came home late from a party around 2 a.m. My house is at the corner from there, and you can see a street light, and there's just darkness, as that's where the track is. I had come home late many times before, but nothing had ever happened. As usual, I parked my two-wheeler and opened the main gate to bring it inside. To my surprise, I saw a faceless lady in full white clothing. I tried to focus on her face, but I couldn't see it. She was standing near the streetlight about 100 meters away. I panicked and quickly moved my vehicle inside. When I turned to lock the gate, she was only 10 meters away, still faceless. Her figure was plain white and wavering in front of me. I ran inside in a sweat and woke up my dad, who told me to pee and sprinkle some on my head to make myself impure. I was so scared I actually wet my pants. I had a high fever for the next 4 days before things went back to normal. I'm 100% certain the thing I saw wasn't human. I saw a ghost floating inches above the ground, and I'll never forget the faceless figure. I've researched but haven't found much, and if anyone can explain or share similar experiences, I would really appreciate it. So my mum has this friend who's been visited by a ghost for over 20 years. It sounds wild, but she swears it's true. She's a single woman who lives alone with her cat, and this ghost is a man who just shows up. She's described him in crazy detail, his face, his age, even the way he stands, but he's never spoken to her or done anything creepy. He's just there, popping in and out of her like some kind of quiet spectral roommate. The story gets even weirder though. A while ago, one of her friends lost her husband. He passed away quite unexpectedly, and after the funeral, this woman had a visit from him. She described him as being super cheerful, smiling, wearing this bright red sweater with a white collared shirt underneath. She thought it was so strange and vivid that she called her friend the widow and told her what she'd just seen. Here's the part that gave her chills. Her friend listened and then said, "That's not even the outfit he died in. It's not even what he was buried in." Like, what? How does that even happen? Can a ghost just change their clothes? I have no idea, and honestly I don't think anyone does. I'm not saying this is definite proof of the afterlife or anything, but it's one of those stories that makes you wonder. At least, it does to me, and it's been stuck in my head ever since I heard it. When I was around 12, my parents got a divorce, and my mum could no longer afford the condo that we had primarily grown up in. During one of the days that we were cleaning and moving out of the house, my mum, uncle and myself were there. I was in my bedroom cleaning the windows, and my mum and uncle were in the kitchen and living room. We had a wooden sliding door that sort of acted as a window between the kitchen and the living room. So like I said, I was cleaning the window, and I began to hear deep breathing, but not winded. It sounded like an animal on the prowl almost. That's the only way I can describe it. I immediately looked around my room, and there was simply nothing there. I was freaked out a bit, but I just went back to cleaning the windows. And there was a weird feeling I kept getting though. I had this weird feeling that something was behind the foot of my bed. I had a wooden headboard and end board on my bed, and I kept looking towards the foot of my bed as I was cleaning the windows, but every time there was nothing. I sort of beat myself up for believing something was there at the moment and tried to forget about it, focusing on the window yet again. A few minutes later I heard the breathing again, but it was louder and to my right towards the foot of the bed. I looked and there it was. All I could see was the top of its face. Its eyes were menacing and purple. I've never been able to explain why its eyes were that color. and it's one of the most disturbing parts of my experience. There was something sinister behind the way it was looking at me. Its skin was flaky and grey, so flaky that it looked like you could easily pick off a piece if you wanted to. Its hair was also blackish grey, dirty and matted. It had no nose. Picture a skeleton and that was pretty much its nose, just missing. I'm 22 now, and still think about it to this day. I can still hear the heavy breathing, and can still see the face, and can still feel its eyes staring at me. I live in a new building, 2 stories, with a half bath under the stairs on the first floor, with a hallway leading to the living room where I have a couch. About 2 months ago, I was getting ready for work at around 5:15 a.m, and I needed to poop. I went to the half bath under the stairs, and after a few minutes I heard rapid footsteps going down the stairs above my head, and immediately got grumpy when one of my kids was awake. I stood up and opened the door to see no one. Oh, must have been a cat, I thought. I sat back down, and after a minute I heard 3 knocks above my head. After a minute, another 3. Weird, maybe the plumbing. Fast forward about 2 weeks ago. I woke up at 3 a.m. for work at 6 a.m, so I went downstairs to lay on the couch to read as to not bother my wife. I wore glasses for distance and didn't have them on while I laid on the couch to read. After about 30 minutes of reading, I heard footsteps descend the stairs, so I put down the book, thinking it was one of my kids. As I looked towards the base of the stairs, I saw a blurry figure peer around the corner of the stair towards me. I sat up, and the figure immediately disappeared, seemingly upstairs. Thinking it was one of my kids, I turned the light on so I could see better, went upstairs, only to find all of my kids soundly asleep. I turned the hallway light on after that, and glanced at the end of the stairs regularly. I told my wife about this, and she says I was just sleep-deprived and couldn't see without my glasses. But I don't know. With such a new building, though, it's weird there's an entity at all. But what do you all think? I've experienced paranormal events throughout my life, starting from high school until now, although it has tapered off now that I've hit middle age. From sleep paralysis, shadow figures, whispers, phantom touch, etc. To grow up in 2 haunted apartments. The only time I've seen a solid apparition while awake was when I was in graduate school in Tennessee. I was at school all Thursday during the day and was cramming for an exam, so I stayed up all night. I finally fell asleep at midnight on Friday. I slept with the light on because I wanted to wake up early to cram some more. I was sleeping on my side facing the closet, and I woke up, eyes still blurry, seeing a pair of legs. I cleared my eyes and panicked, sat up and saw my classmate Jenny. She had a 1,000-yard stare look at me and whispered, "Ted," and then she withered away like smoke. I froze, and my heart was beating at 1,000 beats per minute. I guess when it comes to fight or flight, I freeze. Immediately I rationalized it. It was a hallucination. I had been sleep-deprived. I imagined everything. I glanced at my alarm clock and it was 2:04 a.m. I went outside into the kitchen and got some water. The whole time I was thinking about the apparition. I thought I would have to see Jenny later, although I'd have to find an excuse because I only hung out with her a few times in a group setting. I went back to sleep and was awoken by what felt like someone holding both of my shoulders and shaking them. Of course, there was no one. The room felt heavy. It was early January and it was cold outside, so the heater was on. It must have been too hot. I opened the balcony door to let some air in. However, it was still too heavy, like there's a pressure in the room. It felt suffocating. I couldn't go back to sleep, so I went outside to the living room and studied instead. At 7 a.m. I got a call from my friend Macy, who was Jenny's roommate. I was supposed to meet up with Macy for a study group, so I wasn't surprised to see her call. She told me Jenny died in her sleep last night, and Macy was hysterical because she was the one that found her body. I tried my best to stay calm and comfort Macy. Meanwhile, my mind was racing at the possibilities that I did not have a hallucination, and that what I saw was an apparition. I found out casually later, because I didn't want to pry or tell anyone what I saw. I thought it would have been disrespectful and upset Jenny's friends and family. Jenny passed at around 1:55, and she appeared to me around 6 to 7 minutes later. I never told anyone at school about this because, like I said, it would have been upsetting, and I never got a clear message from her. Her passing, although of natural causes from a disease, was traumatic due to hemorrhage. I tried looking out for Macy because she discovered a gruesome scene. I had to sleep over with her in a new apartment because it took a while for her to be able to sleep by herself. I'd never seen an apparition before, nor have I seen one since. But that was memorable and terrifying. Now that I'm older, I wish I would have gotten a message from Jenny. Maybe that would have helped her somewhat. She was loved by family and adored by friends, at least from what I saw at her memorial. But to just say my name and fade away is something that will haunt me forever. When I was moving into my new apartment, I went to view the place, and the landlord mentioned it was undergoing some renovations. He explained they were slightly gutting it, because as he put it with a sigh, the last tenant lived here a very long time. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press him about it, but something about the way he said it made me suspicious. I didn't ask if someone had died there, though part of me couldn't help but wonder. Fast forward to my first night in the apartment, everything seemed fine at first, until it wasn't. I started noticing strange things happening, little incidents that didn't make sense. It began with a touch lamp I owned. It was one of those lamps that turns on and off when you tap the base. But here's the thing. It would switch on and off by itself, no one near it, no reason for it to act up. At first I thought it might just be a wiring issue, but then another odd thing occurred. Books would slide off shelves, small objects would shift or fall when I wasn't looking, and the lamp kept at it, flickering like it had a mind of its own. This went on for months, long enough that I couldn't just chalk it all up to a coincidence. There was an unsettling energy in the apartment, something I couldn't quite explain but definitely felt. Then one day I went to check my mail, and among the usual junk and bills, I found a medical bill addressed to someone I'd never heard. It wasn't for me, so obviously I wrote return to sender on it and put it back in the mailbox. Before I sent it off though, I jotted down the name. I couldn't shake the feeling it might be important. Later that evening, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to Google the name. On a whim, I added obituary to the search, and sure enough, a result popped up. A man with the exact same name had passed away in my town just a month before I moved into the apartment. My stomach dropped. In that moment, everything clicked. The strange occurrences, the landlord's cryptic comment about the previous tenant, it all made sense. I didn't need proof. I knew it was him. Somehow, he hadn't completely left the apartment. I lived in a house near a very busy intersection in Anchorage, Alaska. At the time, I studied at night, and would return home from school at around 10:30 p.m. After having a coffee and something to eat before heading to bed, I used to sit and talk with my mother. Around midnight, we would constantly hear what sounded like a tour bus filled with teenagers passing by the intersection of the nearby street. It made no sense. At least once or twice a week, we would hear this strange commotion, which we associated with a busload of excited kids. Our curiosity grew. Our neighbors were an older couple who had lived there much longer than us. My mother, increasingly frustrated by the bus passing by at such a late hour, decided to ask them if they had ever heard of it. When she asked, our neighbor's face turned pale. She nervously explained that some years prior there had been a tragic accident at that very intersection. Apparently, a van transporting several kids had been involved in a terrible crash. The driver had ignored a red light while speeding, and all 6 passengers lost their lives. The accident had shaken the neighborhood deeply. Intrigued, I recently visited the local newspaper archives and found articles detailing the accident. As far as I recall, it took place in December of '96. Was it residual energy from that tragic event that echoed through the night? It was a cold December evening in the city of Querétaro, in Mexico, and the courtyard of the old house echoed with laughter and music as we celebrated a posada outdoors. That house had always been a topic of conversation among the locals, and many of my friends, many claimed to have seen things they couldn't explain. It was said that in its old rooms and hallways, the ghosts of those who had lived there and died under the care of the priests or the Church of the Cross still lingered. The house, which had once been home to the elderly members of the religious community, carried centuries of history, Every corner seemed to hold a secret, an untold story, and though many avoided talking about it, we knew they weren't the only ones in the courtyard that night. Amid the flickering lights of lanterns and the voices trying to stay cheerful, something happened. My friend suddenly stopped and pointed at her sister. Her sister's curly strand of hair lifted as if by an invisible hand, stretching it horizontally in the air. There was no wind to explain it, nor any prank that we could think of at that moment. We stood still for a few seconds watching it, waiting for it to fall, but it didn't. Instead of feeling scared, we nervously laughed, as if our laughter could push away what we had just witnessed. It seemed so surreal that in that moment we treated it as just another anecdote, one of those strange things that happened in the house. Later, as we reflected upon it, we realized that several gravestones had been dug up in renovations, and we wondered if perhaps the two were related. Maybe we had disturbed those who had been put to rest, and they decided to pay us a little visit for disturbing their peace.